Very good. So we're going to move on now and break this down a little bit and discuss some of the key themes that we're seeing as we advise on technology deals at the moment. And as a first step in the journey, usually it's implementing the software or the technology solution. And so, Simon, from a customer's perspective, what are some of the things that we're seeing?
Well, it's one of the problems that we've always had when you start these processes and when you start to try and develop and deliver a solution for a business is that there's imperfect knowledge, and there's actually imperfect knowledge on both sides. The customer understands or think they understand how their business is operating, but the supplier doesn't necessarily understand how transactions flow through it. But what they do know is that they know their solution. They know how their solution takes data, how their solution kind of processes transactions. And so what we're seeing now is more common is seeing a discovery or a scoping phase where the parties kind of sit together and they understand how the solution works, how the business operates, how transactions move through that business, and therefore how that might kind of work within the confines of the technology solution. The challenge that you've got from a customer perspective in relation to this is if you kind of make an investment at this point in time with a supplier, there is a risk that at the end of it, you may have discovered that actually this is not quite the right solution for you. So there is a degree of kind of need to do your due diligence in advance to make sure that as you start to make this commitment on the scoping side of things and you start to pay for things, that you understand that there is a fair chance that you can get the outcome that you need. Then the discovery or scoping phase is a commitment by the customer to make sure that the solution is what they need, understand better what it is that they are going to be looking for. That requires an investment from them. And that in itself becomes a little bit of a barrier to kind of then saying, well, actually that $50,000 or whatever it is that I've invested at this point, that is not able to be used, and I'm going to have to move somewhere else, which is not something that anybody wants, but it becomes that barrier to leaving. So as part of going into the scoping, it's important to make sure that what you get out the other side of the scoping is something that that still has some value to you, that you understand the way in which your transactions move through your business, that understand the way in which your data is captured, understand the kind of the data that you need to move forward. So at least if you do have to make that call, that you have the ability to use or reuse at least some of it.
Yeah, and I think from a supplier's perspective, this should be, again, a win-win thing for both parties to understand the environment that they're working in before we pull the trigger on the license. As a supplier, I don't see this as a kind of mini RFP, so I've got the deal. This is almost a value-added service for me to say, I'm happy to come in and have a look at how you think you're going to implement my solution and to make sure it works. It's not sort of necessarily about relitigating the contract or giving you a way out at the end of it, because obviously that's going to be difficult for me as a supplier if all my customers are doing that. So I think in terms of giving you something back at the end of, as well, if the customer did have the ability to pull the trigger at the end of discovery, I don't want to be giving away my IP. So it's actually, ideally this would be a great success. If it's not, what am I prepared to give you at the end of it?
And there really is no right or wrong answer to this. It's about making sure that you understand that from a customer perspective and from a supplier's perspective that you're comfortable with the outcome that may happen one way or the other in relation to this. So you go through this scoping phase. You understand at the end of it that this is something that's going to work, and now you want to move through into an actual implementation. And you could actually be doing this through your scoping phase as well. The traditional approach has been kind of this waterfall approach, which is I'm starting here, I want to get to here, therefore this is the flow, this is what's going to happen, and that's what's going to happen under the contract. The challenge with that is, as we've said, you've got imperfect knowledge at the beginning. And as a result of that imperfect knowledge, it may be that what you desire as your outcome is actually not going to work for the best for the business at the end of it. And that is something that you will learn as you go through the process. Doesn't matter how good your scoping phase is, I don't think that you're ever going to be able to kind of discover all of those issues that might be worked through as you go through the full scale kind of implementation. And so a different practice is developed, which is agile. And as the title would suggest, it's a process which is probably a little bit more dynamic. What it is in some ways, it's almost like a series of kind of smaller waterfall processes where you kind of have an aim for the end of a sprint or whatever. And you look at the end of that and you say, well, what have we learned? Does that mean that our next outcome should be slightly different to what we were planning it to be? And you always kind of going back and looking at what you've learned and how that could change where you want to get to next. The real risk from a customer perspective in relation to this is that you have to make sure that there is strong project management and strong documentation throughout the process, just to make sure that you don't end up losing focus on the things that are important to you. You know, it may be that that end destination is not what you want, but you need to make sure that that is a conscious decision that you have kind of moved away from where you thought you wanted to get to somewhere else. And you're always wanting to keep an eye on, you know, the time, the cost, and the outcome to make sure that at the end of it, you still have a successful project. But, you know, Agile gives you that ability to kind of learn on the way through. The risk that you run with a waterfall process, you know, from a supplier perspective, is they don't know everything. And so there is a level of risk if they're committing to get to this outcome. And so they will build that risk factor into their contract if they, you know, and you may well find that as a result of it, that there is extra cost that sits in the project as a result because of the supplier assuming that level of risk.
Yeah, and so there are pros and cons, I think, as you've mentioned, Simon, for suppliers on Agile versus Waterfall. I think generally what we're seeing is suppliers really like working in that Agile manner. One, because developers like to work that way. It's, you know, a much more dynamic and collaborative development approach or implementation approach, which generally, you know, we see suppliers really enjoying. And of course, it gives that flexibility to respond to changing circumstances, particularly if there's imperfect knowledge at the customer end about what it wants to achieve. And then obviously in terms of the supplier's perspective, much more likely to be a kind of time and materials type commercial model, which is obviously great. But again, you're not just going to be provided with a blank check on this stuff. And so what we have seen is sometimes with these implementation projects, it's kind of a hybrid model where you take Agile, you put some governance around how that implementation is going to work, with roles being played by the supplier and the customer side. You work in sprints, you use that governance model, but then there are some touch points around, you know, whether it's estimates of the cost that it's going to involve, or, you know, milestones that need to be achieved by a certain time, just so that you're putting some contractual parameters around that process. And as I say, it's not a blank check.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, with the way that solutions are being kind of stood up these days with you know, and we're about to talk about it with the customization versus configuration, there is an element of, you know, this being de-risked because of the nature of the solutions, you know, that you're going to be looking to implement. And so as part of an Agile process, there is this kind of always this constant assessment as to, am I getting to the point that I want to get to? And some of that can then end up sitting within the customer's control. You know, there is this box of things that they would like to achieve at the end of it, but they may, because of the process they're going through, only get a certain level of kind of the functionality that they're looking for as kind of phase one, or as the minimum viable product that gets stood up, and then they choose other things going forward. So that's kind of part of what we've seen as this hybrid is we can kind of make a commitment that you'll get at least this level of functionality, but you could, depending on what we learn, get more. You know, lots of different ways that we've seen this being cut, but certainly a hybrid is becoming a little bit more common. So then what we're looking at next is this configuration versus customization, and it's fair to say that customization comes with a degree of kind of challenge for any customer, because with a customization, you're getting into the code and you're having to change it for the specific needs of that customer. And the challenge that you've got there is that as the software continues to evolve, the customization has to continue to move with it, and that comes with a cost. And that's a cost in relation to just continuing to move it forwards, but also if issues arise while you were using it, the cost of having to continue to have somebody that understands those customizations, whether it's somebody within your own business or whether it's the supplier's business, in terms of having to pay to keep that kind of working. So configuration is actually, a lot of the software nowadays is coming in a format where there is flexibility about how you can use it, whether that is you want to capture data in this way, whether you want to report in this way, whether you want to engage with the customer in this way. And those are all things that can be configured. So the software itself doesn't change. It's just the way in which you engage with it, the way in which it captures data is kind of set up and stood up in a slightly different way. The theory behind that is it makes a standard piece of software much more available to a lot more people without there being kind of a need to continue to change the underlying code. So as that underlying code continues to evolve, theoretically your software doesn't need to change because it's changing as part of that development part. The other side of it is it also hopefully makes it easier to actually do the implementation and have this thing shaped for you.
Yeah, and as a supplier, I guess I'm just making sure that my customer is kind of on board with how this is going to work. Sometimes that distinction between a configuration and a customization is not always clear, certainly not to customers who haven't done a lot of this stuff in the past. And so making it quite clear that if you want something specific done for you, that's not within the confines of my product, that's going to cost, because that's going to be development time from my engineers to make that happen. So it's bringing the customer along on that journey, helping them understand the benefit of the software that you provide and the configurations that you can do or even they can do within that, versus having to do that further development work, which obviously is sometimes necessary depending on the customer.
Yeah, and look, I mean, again, it's one of those honest conversations that has to happen, because I think too often there is this risk that when you get into these projects, people kind of assume that you're going to be able to change the business to meet the software, and that's got to be an honest conversation that happens. Can we do that, or are you creating barriers to the adoption of the software because the business just cannot change in that way? Those things need to be talked about and considered from both sides in relation to this, because one of the challenges with a configuration model that you've got is that there are only certain things that can be done. There may be a huge level of flexibility, but you may need to embrace that customization, but you need to understand that there is a cost to that and there is a risk to that as well. So once you're kind of getting down this path of, if you are going to do some kind of customization, who should own that customization? And the natural inclination from anybody that pays for something is, if I paid for it, well, I want to own it. But the challenge that I would put to a customer in relation to this is, what's the value for you? What is the driver for you in relation to wanting to own this customization? Is it just because you're spending money, therefore you want to own it? Or is there something underlying that? Because the reality is that this customization is not going to be of an enormous amount of value without the underlying platform. So unless you're going to get into kind of being able to sell that underlying platform, you're not going to be able to sell that customization itself necessarily. So one of the things you need to assess is, why do I want it? If one of the reasons that you want it is because you want to make sure that you maintain your competitive edge, can that be achieved in other ways without owning it? Because the risk with owning the customization is that is definitely not going to be on the development path going forward. The supplier doesn't own it, and so it ends up sitting out here by itself and becomes something that, as this continues to evolve, you don't necessarily get this with it. So the challenge that you've got is, why do I want to own it? If it's that competitive edge, is it, then can you achieve that perhaps by restraints? Can you achieve that by kind of exclusivity for a period of time? Would those sort of things give you what you want? Of course, you need to be careful that your restraint isn't too extensive or too long, because again, if you make it so that they can't sell this to somebody else, then essentially they're not going to be supporting it. It's not going to be on the development path in itself. So it's again coming back to, why would you need to own that customization?
And that's the standard argument from a supplier's perspective is, part of the solution that we've developed is working with a whole bunch of customers, taking those lessons and actually incorporating that IP into our product. So the more customers that say we can't do that, the less successful our product's going to be, and that's often a very fair argument to use from a supplier's perspective. The other one to think through is that obviously if you're a technology vendor and you're keen to get investment on board or potentially have an exit strategy as time goes on, those investors or acquirers are going to want to see that you own your IP. So the more contracts that you have with customers with kind of funky IP positions where the customer has ownership rights or exclusivity, the less pleased generally those people are going to be. And so from that perspective, again, this is a conversation I think customers need to come to the party on.
So then, once we're working through this, the next thing to think about is, what environment does this solution need to work within? And part of this is about making sure that you've got the right kind of integration. Will the software work in the right ways with the environment that I'm operating within? And part of that is and some of this is kind of what happens during the scoping stage and what happens as you go through, if you're running an agile, as you go through that, and as you start to understand the different parts of the environment that it needs to operate within in terms of the other software that it needs to pull information from and share information with. And then it becomes a question of, well, who picks up the cost of making sure that integration happens? Is that capable? Is that configurable within the standard software itself? Is this something that you would expect it to operate with, and who carries that risk? The less standard it becomes, obviously, the greater the risk that you'll get something that doesn't quite work, and there will be kind of extra effort that needs to be done to get it to work.
Yeah, and from the supply standpoint, with integration with existing or third-party systems, I mean, my going-in position is that's all on you, customer. I know my solution. I'll make sure it works. But everything else is you or a third-party vendor making sure that works. Where that probably doesn't hold so well is if I've made a whole song and dance about how my solution does integrate with a whole lot of other well-known solutions. Lots of providers are actually using their APIs as a real selling point these days, and so if you are doing that, then that comes with a level of expectation probably that your system is going to integrate nicely with the customer's existing systems. The other area is also where I myself am integrating third-party technology into the overall solution that I'm selling, and so at that point the customer probably rightly says, well, that's on you, that's part of what you're selling me. So that does get in, it's sometimes in contracts that discussion is a difficult one, but it's again about understanding where those touch points are, and actually the discovery process is often quite good for doing that.
Yeah. So then the final one, and this kind of naturally segues into the next bit, which is about the rights to use, but is the impact of the implementation on the license itself, and that becomes a question of, when do I start paying for this license, and what should I start paying for this license? And the issue that you've got is that if a software supplier was going to license you the software and you're going to have an independent third party do the implementation with the configuration, you'd be paying for that license from day one. And sometimes the issue is the blurring of the lines. If the supplier is also implementing or configuring for you, should you be paying for that license from day one? And so that's one thing that you need to kind of look at is, do you pay for the license? Do you pay for a reduced license during that period of time because you're only using it in kind of a test environment or a non-production environment? So you need to think about those things. And then the other aspect of it, which is always kind of a little bit of a challenge, is this revenue recognition issue. And for those that aren't kind of familiar with it, one of the challenges that a supplier has from a kind of a finance and from a tax perspective is when do they get to recognize the revenue from the sale of the software? And different kind of tax regimes around the world won't allow you to recognize revenue for a software license if there is still some contingency to that software license. So if you take a software license but you want to be able to throw the software out if they can't implement it, then the challenge you've got is that the supplier or the vendor can't recognize that revenue until that contingency is gone. And this is a real challenge for them. So one of the things that ends up being debated is, well, who carries that risk about about whether this thing can be successfully implemented. And the argument, obviously, from a customer point of view is, well, if you're saying that that your software is easy to implement, that it's configurable, and that all of this should be kind of stood up really easily, is why wouldn't you carry that risk? Because at the end of it, the concern we've got is that we've got a piece of software that we can't use because actually it proves that you can't stand it up in the way that we are looking for it to be stood up. So one of the debates is, where does that happen? And one of the things that we've found in the past is that maybe the way to attack this is not by making the software license kind of conditional, but recognizing in the implementation contract that actually, if it can't be implemented because the supplier has done something wrong, that in itself is a right to recover the cost of the license that is of no value to you. And that's certainly a discussion that's that should be had as part of this kind of implementation license approach.
Yeah, and as a supplier, it is an absolutely critical issue, because essentially that's how I make money, is the software license. It's how I recoup all the costs of my R&D. I'm generally not always or don't view myself as a service provider. This is about selling a software solution. And so to the extent that the implementation of it might scupper that deal, I'm going to be very sensitive to that. And so I think in terms of particularly as Simon mentioned before, in a world where we're doing much more kind of configuring of existing software, I would also be asking, well, is that really going to be my fault that you can't implement that as a customer? Much more likely it's because you didn't understand what your requirements were at the outset, and so I don't want to have to carry the can for that. And again, comes back to the more you can do in that discovery phase, the more you can understand where each other's coming from, the less likely that is to play out in a bad way down the track.
Yeah, and look, the good news with this is as things become much more standardized, much more easily configurable, the risk can start to kind of be managed in other ways. And so certainly, some of the stuff that you can look at is, if there is a cost element to, well, if you want us to assume that then there is a different cost in relation to this license, then maybe you look at it in other ways from a customer perspective. Is there somebody else, an independent third party, that could implement it if the supplier can't implement it? There might be other ways that you can manage this risk where you feel comfortable that you don't need to kind of pay the impost of the risk being assumed by the supplier and them saying, well, that's going to come with this extra cost to it. So there's lots of different ways through it. Andrew and I did a deal just recently where actually the supplier was coming into the market. This was the first time that they'd kind of made a sale in this market, and so therefore in those circumstances there weren't other suppliers, and so this was a debate that was had at the table between the customer and the supplier was, but there is nobody else that can implement this if you can't, and so we need to have a conversation about what happens if the implementation doesn't work.